Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by the Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA. I'm Dov Waxman, the director of the Nazarian Center and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies at UCLA. And it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Rob Geist Pinfold. I first met Rob, I think it was about 10 years ago, when he was just about to begin his PhD. And so it's a great pleasure for me to now welcome him to talk about his new book. He is now a lecturer in peace and security in the School of Government and International Affairs at Durham University in the United Kingdom. He's also a research fellow at the Peace Research Center Prague and senior fellow at Charles University's Herzl Center for Israel Studies. Rob holds a PhD in war studies from King's College London. Previously, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the University of Haifa. His work has been published in International Studies Perspectives, the Journal of Strategic Studies, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, and Mediterranean Politics. And his book, Understanding Territorial Withdrawal, Israeli Occupations and Exits, has just been published by Oxford University Press. And you can see a link to purchase the book in our chat box. So without further ado, let me welcome Dr. Pinfold. I want to remind you all that during his presentation, you're welcome to send us your questions for him using the Q&A box, and I will select some of those questions at the end of his talk to pose to him. So now let me welcome Dr. Pinfold. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dov, for that extended and very, very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to see you again, and welcome everyone to this webinar. Many thanks for joining us. I know in the age of post-COVID, Zoom fatigue can be quite significant, so really appreciate you all joining us today. Now, as Dov mentioned, I'm going to talk about my book, Understanding Territorial Withdrawal, Israeli Occupations and Exits, and I'm going to do that by sharing my slides, just so you don't just have to listen to me talking, you get to see some images as well. I'll just check. Can you all see my screen? Yep, thank you, Dov, for the nod, appreciated. Just wanted to check there. So as I mentioned, this book has been recently released by Oxford University Press. It began life long ago when I was a starry-eyed, naive young PhD student asking Dov for all kinds of tips. And it has very recently been released in the United States. It will be released in the rest of the world in the next month. It can already be purchased as online, and the paper copies will be coming out very, very soon. As Gage mentioned, you can also get a link to a discount code for the book. So I know it's quite expensive given it's a university press, but we can give you a little bit of a discount tonight. And thank you for your interest. So my name is, as I mentioned, Rob Geist Pinfold, and I'm going to talk about Israel's occupations and exits, primarily why Israel has left some territories and why it has not left others. So what I'm going to do before I get into the nitty-gritty of the case studies and the findings is I'm going to delineate why you should care about the study of occupation and exit, what's important, not just for the Israeli case study and for the study of Israel, but for territorial conflict more broadly. I'm also then going to subsequently delineate some key findings from this book. What processes manifested in cases of withdrawal that didn't manifest in cases of sustained occupation that continues to this day, particularly, for example, in the case of Israel, the West Bank and the Golan Heights. And just as a kind of a personal intro, I guess my interest in this topic came about because of my sometimes confused and conflicting dual identity as a British Israeli. When I first came to Israel in the early 2000s, this was when territorial withdrawal was very much on the policy agenda in Israel. People were discussing whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. And subsequently, after Israel's withdrawal from the Gaza Strip in 2005, and previously the withdrawal from Lebanon in 2000, there tended to be, I guess, the crystallization of a new consensus within Israel that territorial withdrawal was simply a bad thing. All it did was harm Israel. All it did was damage Israel's national interests and national security. So it was kind of something that was off the cards. And that was the dominant perception in Israel. In the UK, by contrast, and indeed throughout Europe, whenever I broached my PhD topic, when I said I'm looking at what makes Israel withdraw from territory, people would sort of cynically look at me and say, has that ever happened? Has Israel ever withdrawn from territory? So there's a clear knowledge gap there, both inside and outside of Israel, coming from two completely different angles, which is what I sought to address with the PhD, which then, of course, became the book. But why should you care about occupation? Why is occupation important? And what do we mean when we say occupation? Well, terminology is always important, and occupation is an extremely contested term, not just, but definitely very much so in the case of Israel and the Arab-Israel conflict. Legally speaking, an occupation is when a state controls a foreign territory over which it does not claim permanent sovereignty. So you have to distinguish between occupation on the one hand and annexation. So you may have a scenario where a state conquers or takes over the territory of another state, and it doesn't annex that territory, it doesn't apply its sovereignty to that territory. So that's an occupation. The occupier is basically saying, we're here, yes, we're in charge, but this is not our territory. We will eventually one day leave. That's distinct from annexation, where the occupier becomes an annexer when they say, we're actually applying our laws to this territory. This territory can no longer be distinguished from the rest of our territory. This is our sovereign land. So there's this distinction between occupation and annexation that's important to bear in mind as we carry on with this presentation. There are, of course, relatedly, two routes for an occupation to end. One of them is, as I previously mentioned, annexation. An occupier says, we are no longer occupiers, this is our territory from now on. The other is, I guess, something that if you in terms of international norms and law, is the way that we actually want an occupation to end. An occupier withdraws from the territory. They say, yes, this was a temporary occupation. We were here for security reasons or what have you, but now we are prepared or feel compelled to leave, as, for example, was the case in Afghanistan and Iraq with the US-led occupations of those countries. And we should care about these issues simply because occupation and annexation remain prevalent in world politics today. When I initially started this PhD, I used to really struggle to explain to Western audiences that, yes, it might look like the era of territorial conquest and occupation and annexation is over in Europe, but elsewhere, these are actually still prevalent policy choices for states. Given, unfortunately, recent events in Ukraine and Russia's occupation and annexation of parts of Ukraine, I guess I don't really have to go to great lengths to make that argument, because it's clear that territorial conflict, occupation, annexation, and dilemmas of withdrawal are very much here to stay in world politics, and they remain stubbornly so, despite the fact that there are many, many international norms and laws discouraging them. Laws on occupation say it should be temporary and rare. Annexation is very much a no-no. In fact, when you sign up to the UN, you have to sign a pledge saying that you will not annex any of the state's territory. But despite that, as recent examples show, occupation and annexation remain prevalent in world politics today. However, looking at the academic literature, there is a clear research gap. There are very, very few studies of occupations, and there are even fewer studies of withdrawal. The studies that exist often throw around the word occupation without really defining it or using it in a contemporary context. For example, you have I read books on Roman occupation of Gaul, for example. It's quite hard to argue that what ancient Rome was doing in Gaul is a military occupation in the way we understand the term today, just because times have changed so much. Other times there are annexations of territory, like, for example, the British annexation of Ireland, that is referred to as an occupation. So I wanted to be a bit clearer in the terminology by focusing only on contemporary cases of occupation and exit. Why withdrawal then? We've looked at occupation. Why is withdrawal something that's important to study? Well, rather than give you a long list of why withdrawal is important in terms of international norms and laws, I think it's easy to sum it up by way of two quotes. So the first of these is by an Afghan chieftain during the first British invasion of Afghanistan, way back when in 1839. Now, he very presciently said to a British officer, you have brought an army into the country, but how do you propose to take it out? And I think this really encapsulates a persistent policy dilemma for occupiers, that actually going into a country, despite the fact it's risky, dangerous, controversial, It is never anywhere near as difficult as the decision to leave, working out the timing of exit and doing so in a way that enhances or furthers your national security and your national interest. We've seen plenty of cases in recent years where occupiers have sunk into what I call the occupation trap in my book, where despite the fact that the occupation no longer serves the status quo, despite the fact the occupation actually makes the occupier feel less secure, they still opt to remain simply because they're stuck into this path dependency. And that's encapsulated by this second quote. Now, this is completely different pivot. This is from written by George Orwell in his book, Burma Nights. And he recalls when he's in Burma, something a British officer said to him at the time, "We've no right in this blasted country at all. Only now we're here. For God's sake, let's stay here." And again, that encapsulates that occupation trap, that path dependency, where an occupier so often wants to withdraw, but feels themselves compelled to perpetuate the status quo that no one actually likes. Just by way of images here in terms of why occupation and exit remain persistent problems and persistent dilemmas, and how actually some of the issues remain quite similar. So this cartoon on the left is from the 1920s during the US occupation of Haiti, and it's obviously, I guess, determined or characterized by racialized imagery of the time, but it shows a US Marine sort of this idea that you can just go in, teach civilization, and then leave. You have a US Marine sort of talking down to, in a very condescending way, the Haitians, saying, you know, listen, son, you do unto your brothers and you have them do unto you, you know, and that's something that you see unfortunately continuing to this day, this belief that you can just simply go into a country, impose your will, impose your a system of governance, and then leave neatly and quickly. And that is so rarely the case, as we see, by the way, with the Russian occupation of large parts of eastern Ukraine today. You know, obviously that was something that did not go the way that Russia intended. But I also included that map to try and differentiate between different policy choices. Now, this has changed slightly because Russia has actually annexed large parts of Ukraine. But initially, in the initial stage of the invasion, Russia occupied parts of Ukraine and annexed others, like, for example, the Crimea region. You can see there with the distinction in the colours. But as was often the case, occupation led to annexation rather than withdrawal, which was actually what happened in the case of the US and Haiti, though it should be noted that the US withdrew much later than they'd anticipated, having a much more mixed record than they'd hoped for in the country. So withdrawal is a policy problem. An occupation is a policy choice. If occupation is a policy choice, withdrawal is kind of a policy problem. When to withdraw, how to withdraw. The decision to withdraw is very, very rarely an easy one for an occupier. And that's something that's true in different case studies all over the world and different time periods in history. And the duration of occupation, the date of withdrawal in each case study vary very, very significantly and very rarely correspond to what the occupier initially intended when they were going in the first place. So that leads to my research question. Why do some occupations end whilst others persist? What explains this variance in the case studies, particularly in the case of Israel, where you have kind of one country occupying various territories after 1967? Why did it leave some but perpetuated its control over others? And relatedly, in a more academic terminology, I guess, what factors influence an occupier to withdraw from an occupied territory or entrench itself within it? What inputs, what levels of analysis, what processes determine whether an occupier perpetuates a status quo or retrenches it by withdrawing from territory? Now, as you should always do with a good PhD come book, you look at the existing literature. Now, I drew particularly from the literature on territorial conflict. Now, what's interesting here is I think it's largely characterized by, I call them kind of antiquated theoretical paradigm divides between realists on the one hand and constructivists on the other. They're called things slightly differently in this literature field, so they're rationalists and subjectivists, for example. But the bottom line is they both stress very, very different levels of analysis and conceptions of why a territory might be valuable to an occupier or a conquering state. So constructivists, for example, tend to look at what's going on internally within the occupier, the domestic politics, beliefs, views, perceptions, history, and how that influences the occupier's behavior vis-a-vis a given territory. Realists, on the other hand, tend to look at systemic factors, the international international politics and the balance of power to argue why a state may behave a certain way towards a territory. And when they're looking at the value of the territory, they tend to be dichotomized, with realists on the one hand focusing on tangible variables. So what I mean there by tangible variables is what we would like to think of as kind of quantifiable, objective values of that territory because of its value in terms of geography, topography, resources within that territory, demographics, for example, sort of things that are undeniable objective facts that make that territory valuable. Constructivists have a more subtle way of looking at territorial value and look at the territory's intangible value, its relative value to an occupier or conquering state, as I mentioned previously, due to the connection, the relationship between that territory and values, beliefs, history held within that conquering state, within the occupier. So there's that divide between, I guess, what I call relational or objective territorial worth between the constructivists and the realists, or tangible and intangible variables. Now, I was less interested in kind of taking a side in this debate and more interested in how these different levels of analysis and perceptions of territorial worth interact to determine whether an occupation ends or is perpetuated. So, I mean, you can take one thing in common here. They all see territory as a means to an end. So for both realists and constructivists, that territory, states don't conquer a territory just because. They conquer that territory because it enhances or furthers the goals or interests of that state, be they objective interests or subjective interests. So I was looking at kind of building a framework that combines both of those two approaches. And how do I do that? Well, basically, I come up with the assumption that both occupation and withdrawal are strategies. That's kind of the way to frame occupation and withdrawal. They are both taken, they are perceived by the occupier to be utility maximizing choices to promote a political end. So just as territory is a means to an end, occupation and withdrawal likewise are means to an end. And my hypothesis is that withdrawal is the result of escalating costs and declining benefits, which alters the perceived utility of occupation as an effective strategic choice. So occupation begins as a perceived strategic choice. The occupier feels that occupying that territory is the best way to promote their ends. And that can be because of the strategic security value of the territory, or because of the link to that territory, between that territory and an occupier's values, and indeed both of those factors. And rather than pick one level of analysis, I'm interested in looking at how divergent levels of analysis interact to determine whether an occupation ends or is continued. And I call them, rather than levels of analysis, I use the term arenas of bargaining, just to show that, you know, none of these levels of analysis are unitary. You know, they all have different actors with different interests and goals, basically interacting with each other all the time. And it's bargaining and interactions between those three arenas of bargaining that determine or that precipitate withdrawal or the perpetuation of the status quo. So it's not just one level of analysis, it's how those three levels of analysis interact. And the case studies that I picked, well, as you can see here, there's quite a lot of them. This also touches upon the question of why Israel? Why is Israel the focal point of my study? Well, first of all, you know, it's not just something that interests me, or my background is British Israeli, that bias certainly features, but the key factor here is that Israel is a real exemplary case study of occupation and exit. Israel was a young country founded in the late 1940s, but unlike other countries, since then, Israel has managed to become embroiled in territorial conflicts with every single one of its neighbors. Israel's occupied territory from every single one of its neighbors, from Lebanon in the north to Egypt in the south, west to Jordan in the east. And this is very, very unusual that there's such a high level of incidence of territorial conflict and occupation and indeed exit. As this chart here shows you, there are just as much as there are many cases of occupation, there are many, many cases of withdrawal. Israel has withdrawn, for example, from the Sinai Peninsula, from southern Lebanon, from the Gaza Strip. It has not, on the other hand, withdrawn from the West Bank and the Golan Heights. So I was interested in comparing and contrasting here. And this is something why the Israeli milieu is so useful. It gives you the consistency of a single case study, of a single milieu, but then at the same time, the ability to compare that you get from multiple case analysis. So there's plenty of cases here of occupation. They are very different in terms of their duration, but also in terms of Israel's adversaries. You have state-level actors like Egypt and Jordan and Syria, non-state actors like Hezbollah and the Palestinians, and indeed clear divergences in outcome, whether that occupation ended or continued. So there's a methodological case for using Israel as the focus of this study. And also, of course, there's policy ramifications too. The Israel-Arab conflict is something that very rarely leaves the news. It's something that's frequently talked about. This is a topical issue area that's not going away anytime in world politics. I remember when I first started my PhD, I had people say to me, this is not, this is kind of old hat. The Israel-Palestine conflict is dated. Focus on Al-Qaeda, for example. And if you flash forward to 2023, I think you can argue that the Arab-Israel conflict is in the news far more than Al-Qaeda is today. It's an enduring policy issue that simply refuses to go away. And I should just add that by way of comparison, I also added non-Israeli cases of occupation and exit, specifically the US's occupation and exit from the island of Hispaniola, which contains two countries, actually the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And again, those, as you can see here on this chart, those occupations differed in duration. And I included that just to compare, to test for the generalizations. Were they, if they were present in the Israeli case study, were they also present in the US case study? Again, this is something that happened when I made the transition from PhD to book, to add those non-Israeli case studies in order to permit cross-milieu generalizations. Now, what were my key findings? Now, I condensed them to 6 bullet points, 6 commonalities, 6 key points that manifested in every single case in Israel and beyond of territorial withdrawal. The first of these is that withdrawal was a gradual process, okay? A gradual and complex process of policy reassessment caused each withdrawal. Now, that may sound like I'm stating the obvious, but many watchers of Israel or people who are joining us from Israel will know that, in fact, some of these withdrawals were often framed and continue to be perceived by Israel's public as a kind of like spontaneous spur of the moment decision, particularly Israel's withdrawal from the Gaza Strip in 2005. In my interviews, when I was gathering data for this project, I had many erudite former decision makers close to centers of power basically saying to me that Ariel Sharon, Israel's prime minister at the time, got up one morning and just decided that Israel was going to leave Gaza. And I demonstrated in my book that this really was not the case. It's far more complicated than that. It was the result of this complex process of policy reassessment caused by increasing costs within each of those 3 levels of bargaining that made Israel's leaders slowly but surely question the utility of the status quo of occupation and begin to preference withdrawal as a policy option that better furthered Israel's national interests. The second key point in commonalities, enemy violence. Unprecedented enemy violence preceded each withdrawal. Now, if you think about it, this kind of makes sense because every occupation was instigated to make the occupier feel more secure. So if there's this upsurge in violence, it might often be that the occupier then perceives that it's actually the occupation that's promoting violence, the occupation that's making the occupier less secure, that's causing casualties, that's costing blood and treasure. So it might be a good idea to recalibrate the occupation and pursue withdrawal instead. Now, I should add a cautionary note there because this often leads to people saying to me, okay, so you're saying, violence is the answer. What the Palestinians need to do is act violently against Israel. Now, so like I say, that requires a cautionary note because it's just not so simple. Yes, that enemy violence was a key factor, but there's all these other points as well. And the occupier only withdrew when it failed to mitigate that violence. So there was always a violent response from the occupier to the violence in the bilateral arena between occupier and occupied. And it was when the occupier failed to actually perpetuate the status quo that it considered withdrawal. So it's not just the violence that's the necessary factor, it's the fact that the occupier then can't end the violence itself through violent means. The third factor here is international bargaining. So in the international arena, the enemy violence refers more to the bilateral arena between occupier and occupied. The international bargaining is more about the international arena, bargaining between the occupier and third parties that accompanied and preceded each withdrawal. So it's not just about relations between occupier and occupied. As you can imagine, when there's an escalation in enemy violence and the occupier's violence, this tends to attract international attention and international criticism. So you have costs mounting in the bilateral arena, but then costs for the occupier also start to mount in the international arena. So it's kind of a two-pronged process, which causes the occupier to rethink the occupation's strategic utility. Point number 4, no Israeli withdrawal and no withdrawal at all was ever truly unilateral. Now, this refers, as many watchers of Israel will know, to 2 specific case studies which I examined: Israel's withdrawals from the Gaza Strip and southern Lebanon. Now, supporters and detractors of both those withdrawals see them as unilateral. If you support them and you argue they're unilateral, it tends to be you tend to use a narrative, the Zionist narrative of, this is Israel taking its fate into its own hands. We don't wait for the enemy to tell us what to do. We leave because it's right for us to leave. On the other hand, critics of the withdrawal said the fact that they're unilateral proves that they are irrational, that they're a mistake. Israel, as Benjamin Netanyahu argued, gave up territory in return for nothing. And in no case study was that actually true. First of all, Israel got concessions in both those withdrawals, as I'm going to talk about a little bit more later. And secondly, Israel did not act unilaterally. It simply changed its bargaining partner. So this kind of ties into the international bargaining point here. So in the withdrawal from Gaza, Israel didn't negotiate with the Palestinians, for example, but they sat down with the Americans. And these were not just negotiations for negotiation's sake. These talks with the Americans actually determined where Israel would withdraw from, i.e. the Gaza Strip and parts of the West Bank, and what concessions Israel would get from the Americans in return. So this is actually very, very similar to the paradigm of land for peace as exemplified by UN Security Resolution 242, that Israel gives up territory in return for political concessions. Now, whereas Resolution 242 sees those political concessions as coming from the Arab world, Israel simply got those political concessions from somewhere else, from the United States, as I'm going to talk about, I'm willing to talk about a little bit more later, or indeed in the questions. Number 5, a pro-exit domestic consensus preceded each withdrawal. So no withdrawal was kind of hoisted or foisted on Israel's body politique by a political elite who were out of touch with society. In every single case, withdrawal commanded the majority of public and elite support. And this is kind of the gradual shift from occupation being the consensus policy to withdrawal being the consensus policy. And number 6, and that's the one that intrigues me personally the most, that every time an occupier withdrew, it entrenched itself elsewhere. So this, I guess, it is something real food for thought, because we often think of territorial withdrawal as conflict resolution, what an occupier needs to do to make things better for everyone. But actually, every time an occupier withdrew, it used that withdrawal and the decreasing of domestic, bilateral and international pressure as a result of that withdrawal to entrench itself in a contested territory elsewhere. Just by example, Israel negotiated over leaving the Sinai under Menachem Begin, Israel's right-wing leader. The Americans and the Egyptians sought to have a comprehensive peace where Israel would not just withdraw from the Sinai, but other territories that had captured in the Six-Day War of 1967, for example, the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Menachem Begin would have none of it, and when the Americans and Egyptians gave up on this demand, and Israel eventually left the Sinai, Begin used the goodwill generated by that withdrawal to entrench Israel elsewhere, noticeably by annexing the Golan Heights in 1981, just as an example. And these commonalities, then, these 6 points were absent in the Golan Heights and the West Bank. And again, that's the thing I'm going to talk about a little bit more as we go on. So the first point here, one of the key points here, the domestic consensus. So as I said before, every occupation began as a consensus policy. And indeed, if you take, for example, Israel's occupation of southern Lebanon, this took place in 1985 as Israel retrenched its broader occupation of the rest of Lebanon. And this was a real it was a consensus policy. because the government at the time was comprised of the centre-left Labour Party and the right-wing Likud. Likud members didn't really want Israel to end its occupation of Lebanon. They wanted Israel to stay in Lebanon. Labour members of the Labour elite wanted Israel to leave all of Lebanon. So the consensus was the construction of what we now know as the security zone, this kind of several mile long strip where Israel continued to occupy large parts of southern Lebanon and didn't leave until another 15 years later. And by the way, it's another example of the occupation trap. When Shimon Peres announced the policy, one of the Labour stalwarts, Shimon Peres, he said that this would be Israel's last winter in Lebanon. And it wasn't until another 15 years later that Israel withdrew from Lebanon under the leadership of another Labour leader, Ehud Barak. And every withdrawal becomes a consensus policy. So you start off with occupation as a consensus policy, and then it's bargaining within and across those three arenas of bargaining, international, bilateral, and domestic. That means the occupation is delegitimized, and people start within the elite and indeed public opinion start to preference withdrawal as the more strategic policy. And that includes the Gaza disengagement of 2005. And I mention that specifically because many people on the Israeli right see this as kind of a policy that was, as I say, kind of thrust upon Israel's unwilling body politic by out-of-touch elite leaders or indeed a deep state. And this simply was not true. Yes, it was a contentious policy. Yes, it stirred opposition in parts of society. But throughout the entire process, the withdrawal from Gaza commanded a majority of public support. And it's about looking at, what changed in that process. Why did occupation become so delegitimized publicly? And that's something I'm going to look at further, for example, with the role of enemy violence. And it's important to contrast that delegitimization of occupation and preferencing of withdrawal to the West Bank and the Golan, where that simply did not happen. And that's where these two pictures here come into play. If you look at the that picture on the right there, the top right, those are protesters against Israel's withdrawal from the Golan Heights when there was talk about Israel withdrawing in the late 90s and early 2000s. Now, if you look at those protesters and you compare them to protesters against Israel's disengagement from Gaza, you see a completely different demographic. Indeed, many of those who protested Israel's withdrawal from the Golan or potential withdrawal from the Golan were members of the Labour Party. They were centre-left, secular, affluent, middle-class Israelis, and there was kind of a national consensus against any withdrawal. So in the Golan, unlike in the other case studies, occupation or indeed annexation, remained the consensus policy. It was never delegitimized, which is why Israel retained the territory, because it tied Israel's hands in negotiations with the Syrians. The bottom right shows a similar dynamic in the case of the West Bank. This is one of Israel's many elections which we had in recent years. And this was just before Benjamin Netanyahu, who was prime minister, was joined in government by Benny Gantz from the centrist opposition, the Blue and White Party. Netanyahu ran on a platform of annexing parts of the West Bank. Funnily enough, Benny Gantz's Blue and White Party ran on a platform of annexing parts of the West Bank. Yes, it was different parts of the West Bank, but it shows you that, just as in the case of the Golan, annexing parts of the West Bank, i.e. not withdrawing from the entire West Bank, remained a consensus policy on Israel's both right, centre and left, unlike in the other case studies where exit took place. Now I want to go a little bit further to talk about enemy violence. So, it's key to show the role of enemy violence is critical for delegitimizing in the domestic arena an occupation. So I'll give you an example. Israel's occupation of the Sinai Peninsula from 1967 to the early 1980s, prior to the Yom Kippur War of 1973, October 1973, Israel's public were polled, and 90% of Israelis said they'd actually prefer keeping the Sinai Peninsula to peace with Egypt. And this was actually the government's position. So it showed you that this was a domestic consensus in both Israel's elite and public opinion. And then everything changed after the Yom Kippur War. As soon as the Yom Kippur War had taken place, suddenly the status quo is delegitimized. Israelis on the right and left start questioning whether occupation really brings Israel security. And eventually, in the 80s, when Israel does leave the Sinai Peninsula, it is backed by an almost similar majority of public and elite opinion. So it shows you that even a conflict like the Yom Kippur War, which Israel didn't decisively lose, still delegitimized the utility, the perceived utility of an occupation. And it was a necessary step to lead to Israel's policymakers considering withdrawal. And that's even clearer when you look at some, in terms of international dynamics. So Anwar Sadat, Egypt's leader, actually tried to get an interim agreement with Israel with American mediation before the Yom Kippur War. He was actually interested in diplomatic bargaining rather than violent bargaining with Israel. He petitioned the Americans for help in this. And Henry Kissinger, who at the time I believe was National Security Advisor, he said to Sadat, look, I've got too much on my plate, and I'm not going to deal with your problem unless it's a crisis. And then Sadat takes that to mean, okay, I need to use violence to create a crisis. And then you have the Yom Kippur War as a direct result of that. So it shows you how enemy violence is not just important for delegitimizing the status quo within the occupier, but also for increasing international pressure against the occupier and international attention to the occupation. And similar line here, you have Yitzhak Shamir, Israel's prime minister, saying he was asked about changing policy in the West Bank. And this was the late 80s, mid 80s, sorry. He said, what's burning Maboel? Like, there's no need to change policy in the West Bank because everything's actually kind of okay as is. And then, ironically, it was a couple of years after that comment, the Palestinians begin the first intifada, this campaign of civil disobedience that often spills over into violence, which leads Israelis to reconsider the status quo. However, there was no retreat under fire, and this is something that's really important to emphasize. Often, these conclusions are, I guess, taken up by opponents of withdrawal to say, aha, it shows you that actually Israel just retreated under fire. These withdrawals were irrational. They didn't make any sense. It was simply, a casualty-averse civil society who were unable to perpetuate an occupation, even if it was effective. But actually, as I say, in every single case, Israel didn't cut and run, or the United States and Haiti and the Dominican Republic did not cut and run. They responded to violence with violence of their own. And it was only when their violent response failed to mitigate or quell enemy violence to the extent they could simply perpetuate the status quo that they then consider withdrawal. And that's actually a mistake the Palestinians made in the West Bank. Israel left southern Lebanon in 2000, obviously apparently unilaterally. The Palestinians felt, okay, well, there's no point negotiating with Israel, no point having diplomatic bargaining. We can use violent bargaining like Hezbollah to get Israel to leave the entire territory. Leads to the second intifada. But actually, in that case, Israel uses violence to suppress the second intifada and does so very, very effectively, leading to a perpetuation of the status quo, which we still see today. So it was that mistake by the Palestinians buying into this retreat narrative, which was one of the key reasons why Israel didn't leave the West Bank, simply because negotiations, a paradigm of negotiated diplomatic bargaining, never fully replaced that violent bargaining. And then in the Golan Heights, you never really saw, after the Yom Kippur War of October 1973, the Golan Heights actually became Israel's quietest border. The Syrians made a mistake. They thought they could use Israel's occupation of the security zone. They could attack Israel there to delegitimize the occupation of the Golan Heights. But actually, all it did was delegitimize the occupation of southern Lebanon, the security zone, and it didn't make Israelis rethink the status quo within the Golan Heights. I see that we are pushed for time, so I will try and speed things along a little bit. In terms of international bargaining, so this chart on the left, I don't want to go into too much detail, but you often hear a lot about the US-Israel special relationship, how the US gives Israel $3 billion a year in aid indefinitely, because of an Israel lobby or what have you. But actually, territorial withdrawal plays a key role here as well. If you look at this chart on the left, you can see that there's a huge uptick in US aid to Israel in 1975, and that is a direct result of Israel leaving parts of the Sinai Peninsula. So, basically, the US was involved as a mediator, and the US looked to change Israel's strategic preferences by offering them something better than perpetuating occupation of the Sinai, getting a significant amount of political and economic aid from the world's most preeminent superpower. And this actually works. Basically, as Shimon Peres, who was an opponent of withdrawing from the Sinai at the time, he argued, look, in the end, we gave up a little to get a lot. We got this de facto alliance with the US. And you see another massive escalation in aid in 1979, precisely for the same reasons, because Israel agreed to leave the entire Sinai under Menachem Begin. On the right here, one thing I do want to focus on here is that map on the bottom right. You see there's a little kibbutz this is the Lebanese-Israel border. The kibbutz is called Misgav Ha'am. This is important because we often think of Israel's withdrawal from Lebanon as unilateral, that Israel simply just left the territory without negotiating with anyone. But actually, Israel negotiated and bargained with the UN to the extent where the UN and Israel actually sat down and delineated the border, because Israel had been in Lebanon for so long, since 1982, no one knew where the border was. And the Lebanese wouldn't play ball, they wouldn't negotiate. So in something that was very, very rare in international politics, the UN took the place of Lebanon in this bargaining equation and debated and bargained with the Israelis about where the border should be. And both sides actually worked out, by the way, that parts of Misgav Ha'am were in Lebanon. This kibbutz had crept over into Lebanese territory. The Israelis came to the to the UN, and said, look, we can't kick people out of their homes for this withdrawal. And the UN agreed. And in return, Israel gave up land elsewhere in northern Israel, which was ceded to Lebanon. So you actually had the UN agreeing with Israel to change Lebanon's border without any involvement from the Lebanese. But it shows you that the withdrawal wasn't actually unilateral, as is often claimed. Finally, in terms of Israel used withdrawal from one territory to entrench itself elsewhere, that is no truer than in the West Bank. Now, this here shows, this map on the left shows the Elon plan, the supposed division of the territory, which Israel wanted to enact after 1967, returning parts of the territory to Jordan, rather than the Palestinians, and annexing parts of it for itself. Now, the configuration of land has changed over time, but the long story short is that Israel has consistently sought to leave parts of the West Bank whilst annexing others. Israel sees the West Bank through a different prism. In the international community, we tend to think of the West Bank as one contiguous unit, but Israel sees the West Bank in kind of in a dichotomy. Some of it really values and wants to keep forever, and some of it wants to leave. And obviously that's a generalization, but you can see it manifesting time and time again in Israeli policy. And often Israel will leave parts of the West Bank, and whilst leaving parts of the West Bank in a kind of territorial give and take, will use that withdrawal to entrench itself in the parts of the West Bank it wants to keep. This often leads to frustration in the international and bilateral arenas, because it's seen that Israel isn't negotiating in good faith. You know, it's leaving some territory, giving it to the Palestinians whilst building in settlements elsewhere. But this is actually a kind of Israeli praxis 101, using territorial withdrawal to entrench itself in another disputed territory. And that's also true, by the way, in the case of the Golan Heights and southern Lebanon, that Israel basically often felt that it wouldn't leave the security zone until it reached a deal with Syria, because Syria was so powerful within Lebanon. But that would require Israel to leave the Golan Heights. Now, as we saw previously, Israelis didn't want to leave the Golan Heights. So Ehud Barak, Israel's prime minister in 2000, quite aptly changes the equation. He says, look, if we leave southern Lebanon, there'll be much less pressure on Israel to give up the Golan Heights. And this is why Israel's withdrawal from southern Lebanon is actually backed by the opposition, Likud, led by, at the time, a guy called Ariel Sharon, who, you know, features in some of these case studies, because it was seen as Israel giving up territory it didn't really value, which would then allow it to perpetuate its control over territory it did value, the Golan Heights. So by way of conclusion, then, I think I'll do this very, very quickly. But overall, my study shows you that, you know, this claim that the only language they understand is force is only part of the story. OK, it's a reductionist and dangerous claim that actually can sometimes lead to more occupation, as you saw in the West Bank. Secondly, unilateral withdrawal is not actually a true policy option for Israel. It never was and it never has been. Israel may have changed its bargaining partner, but Israel has never left any territory unilaterally. It also shows you the necessity of international third-party bargaining, the need for mediation, because in many cases, for example, Israel's withdrawal from the Sinai, Israel and Egypt were only moderately interested in relations with each other. The key interest, national interest of both states, was cultivating ties to the mediator, the United States. And finally, in Israel and beyond, occupation is actually a relatively ineffective policy choice. Now, I guess that's quite an easy argument to make in the wake of the US's withdrawal from Afghanistan and Iraq and Russia's quagmire in Ukraine. It tends to lead to path dependency and entrenchment. And the result can be a kind of non-intentional annexation, as many people argue is the case in the West Bank today, or a contentious withdrawal which divides public and elite opinion. And I will stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Rob, for that fascinating presentation. We have about 15 minutes and we have quite a few questions. So please do continue to send us your questions. Hopefully we'll have time for Rob to answer some of those. I'm going to take the prerogative, though, as the moderator to ask one of my own to get things going. And I wanted to pick up on the point you made about this kind of cost-benefit calculation that underlies the decision whether to stay or to leave. And I wonder whether, an occupier might place more weight on costs than benefits. In other words, when instead of it simply being a kind of, utility maximization, costs and benefits of being given equal value, prospect theory and psychology would suggest that actually it's costs that weigh far more heavily than anticipated benefits. And so I wonder if you see that, if it's been much more about negative costs rather than positive benefits. And this obviously has implications which we can talk about for the future as well, in terms of, presenting Israel, for example, with incentives or disincentives.
That's a really good question. And I've actually got a colleague at the Hebrew University, her PhD, she tried to quantify the costs of each of these occupations, or to show why Israel withdrew. And I really struggle with that approach, simply because in every single case that I saw, there was never just this sort of pessimistic, look, guys, the occupation isn't working, this is a nightmare, this is a quagmire, everything's bad. There was always, you had to sell the withdrawal to the Israeli public, or indeed the US public. It was never just a case of saying that everything was bad. You also had to think about how withdrawal would be more strategically beneficial and better for your national interest. So yes, in the case of Gaza, the occupation of Gaza, people were saying, Israelis were dying on a weekly basis. It was a nightmare to protect these settlements. But at the same time, there's all sorts of strategic calculations saying, if we do leave, it'll be easier for us to justify a kinetic response to enemy attacks. If we do leave, Israel will no longer be called an occupier, for example. So there are all sorts of, and also, this contentious political occupation will end. So I think there's just as much positive as there is negative in each of these cases, and you need both, especially in a divided society like Israel. You need to sell a vision of a better tomorrow, or a way to better advance Israel's national interests, rather than just saying what we have at the moment is really bad for us.
Thank you. So one more question from me before I open it up from questions from the audience, and this is about the question of partial withdrawal, rather than withdrawal being a kind of stay or go. Are there other cases of kind of partial territorial withdrawals where an occupier might decide to limit their exposure to some of the costs, but still seek to remain permanently in at least part of the territory?
Are you talking beyond Israel, for example?
Beyond the Israeli case, yeah, as far as you might know.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I'll muddy the waters a little bit, because this is a case study of annexation rather than occupation, but it is close to home, so you'll allow me a bit of creative license. If you look, for example, at the partition of Ireland, the Great Britain had annexed all of Ireland, so Ireland was considered part of part of Britain. It wasn't an occupied territory in the view of the Crown. It was part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. When there was the Irish Civil War, the uprising by the IRA against the British state, which led to the partition of the country. There was a discussion in Whitehall, and there was a decision that, look, if we give up now, if we agree to give up parts of Ireland that we don't care about that much, okay, we have to give up Dublin. But the rest of the country, we've always had a bit of a nightmare governing, and it doesn't really have any resources in it anyway. It has a hostile population. If we give up that territory, we can use that withdrawal, that retrenchment of control, to entrench ourselves in the parts of the territory which do actually have economic value, which do have a supportive population, where all the shipyards are, for example, and that was Northern Ireland. So that's a clear example of that manifesting elsewhere, and indeed in the US. If you read, for example, there's Bob Woodward's book, Obama's Wars. One of Obama's key arguments for leaving Iraq was that then, we could leave Iraq and then get a troop surge in Afghanistan and basically send all those guys who were in Iraq doing no good to Afghanistan, where that is actually in the US's strategic interest to continue the occupation. So this isn't something that is limited with Israel. You see it worldwide.
I see, fascinating. Okay, so we have a few questions. I'm going to group a few of them together so you can kind of take them in one piece, because I think a number of these questions are about the West Bank specifically. And this probably won't surprise you whether, how we should think of specifically Israel's occupation of the West Bank. So one of the questions comes from Alan Levy and asks, does it make a difference that in the case of Israel's occupation of the West Bank, that was preceded by an act of war against the blockade of the Gulf of Aqaba? Similarly, I think Len Bozen asks, what about, does it make a difference if this is one land in a defensive war? Does it make a difference in terms of, say, international law, the nature in which the territory was acquired? And then two other questions I'm going to just put in there. So that was about how Israel came into occupy the West Bank. These two questions about the potential withdrawal. Eric Selkov asks, has there been a withdrawal from a territory where the people of that territory living in there want the destruction of the country that controls the territory, right? So in other words, that it increases the risk? On a similar vein, Lenny Ravitch asks, if Israel left the West Bank, would Hamas and Islamic Jihad take control as they did after the Gaza disengagement? And that is obviously the great fear that many Israeli Jews have. So if you could maybe kind of take all of those together, I know it's quite a lot, that would be great.
A lot of food for thought, some great questions. And, if I don't mention any of them, if I don't answer all of them, feel free to, come back and make me squirm for a bit. In terms of the first one, defensive war, I mean, look, I'm not a lawyer, but the key aspect here, the key thing to consider here is that occupation is not illegal in international law. It is considered as something that is going to happen, okay? You're going to have to intervene in another territory. It's less about what precipitates it, more about how the occupier behaves when they're in that territory. So, for example, as an occupier, you're not allowed to change the status quo on the ground. You're not allowed to, for example, import civilian settlers into that territory to try and change local leadership, for example. And this is something that's very, very complicated when it comes to the West Bank, because Israel will not accept that it occupies the West Bank. At the same time, Israel has not annexed the West Bank. So Israel, even if Israel says it's not occupying the West Bank, its policy suggests otherwise. And Israel has said, even though we're not occupying the West Bank, we will still uphold occupation law, even though this is not a case of occupation. But nevertheless, Israel has repeatedly contravened and broken occupation law quite brazenly and continues to do so today. So it's less a case of what preempted it, more a case of how the occupier behaved. And the West Bank is just, an enigma wrapped in a mystery, wrapped in a puzzle. In terms of some of the other questions, for example, cases of people wanting to destroy that actor. Look, it's hard to generalize and say, look, every single person in southern Lebanon wanted to destroy Israel. One of the issues, one of the reasons why Israel left southern Lebanon, just as an example, is that they felt that actually that occupation was legitimizing a harsh anti-Israel stance. When Israel actually initially went into southern Lebanon, the Shia population of the territory welcomed them. There was a case of them showering them with rice and being very, very welcoming, because they felt like actually the Israelis would be less bad as occupiers than the Palestinians that were occupying the territory beforehand and using it as a state within the state. And actually, Ehud Barak, when I interviewed him, he said to me, look, it was our occupation that gave birth to this, to Hezbollah. It created the Hezbollah threat. Hezbollah didn't exist before we were in southern Lebanon. And, we really poured the fuel on the fire of radicalization. So it's interesting to look at just how occupation makes people hate your hate an actor, and actually fuels I guess, more extreme voices in that case. And sorry, Dov, can you remind me the final question there?
It was about this idea of Hamas, the risk, I guess, of Hamas and Islamic Jihad taking over. I mean, that's the lesson, if you like, that Israelis have learned, that, withdrawals lead to more insecurity, rockets, etc.
Look, I mean, this is a whole discussion for another time, but I'll answer it by pivoting to the Gaza withdrawal. So, we're talking about positives and stuff, selling positives to the Israeli public. Often Ariel Sharon said that, look, this would make the Palestinians take, their own responsibility, that there was even talk about Gaza turning into, this sort of the Hong Kong of the Middle East or what have you, because the Palestinians would be able to, be free of Israel's involvement. But at the end of the day, if you ask the people who came up with this policy, no one actually thought this was going to happen. People like Amnon Sofer, who was one of the key guys who provided the inspiration for the withdrawal, I've been arguing it for ages. He even wrote in public policy papers that the day after Israel leaves, we'll get bombarded by rockets, Hamas will take over. But he argued, look, it doesn't matter because we don't care. Let them do their thing in Gaza. It's better for us to be away, and then we can simply control the territory from afar. We don't have to physically occupy Gaza to control Gaza. And this is what led to the argument today that actually the Gaza Strip is still occupied because, okay, Israel might not be in there physically with troops, but Israel controls entry and access. It controls all of Gaza's airspace. It controls how far fishermen in Gaza can fish, and it controls most of the borders. So I guess, that's kind of the question to consider. Okay, it looked like, Israel withdrew from Gaza to create this paradise, but actually Israeli leaders knew this was never going to happen. And Israel has ways to stop this happening in the West Bank. The question is whether Israel actually doesn't want that to happen. And that's a real open question that, you'd have to talk to Israel's policymakers to get an answer there. And I suspect you won't get a straight answer.
So we only have a few minutes, but we have a couple of questions that have come in, and I think it would be remiss not to discuss them in terms of the implications, the practical implications. Nate Shields, who's a postdoc with us at the Nazarian Center, has asked about what are the practical implications of these findings. And another one of our students here at UCLA also asks about that. What does it mean, particularly for the international community, in terms of negotiating a potential withdrawal? Are there lessons that international actors could learn, as well as Israelis and Palestinians themselves? So I guess both of these questions are particularly focused again on the potential for encouraging an Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank.
Yeah, I think that they're both related. They're both very, very good questions. I think the key factor here is, I guess the key takeaway is that, as I said before, Israel is unlike the international community because it does not see the West Bank as one contiguous entity. It looks at the West Bank through very, very different dichotomized lenses. And I think that the key takeaway from that is that it's very hard to see any scenario, for me anyway, where Israel would withdraw from the entire West Bank. And one of the ways that you can entice Israel to withdraw from most of the West Bank is by saying, okay, you can keep that 10% of the territory that you particularly value, but to keep that, you're going to have to get out of 90% of it, for example. And that's something that the international community can work on. I mean, look, we've seen amazing offers to Israel. The Arab Peace Initiative is a Saudi-led initiative from the early 2000s of every Arab and Muslim state in the world, including Iran, offering peaceful negotiations with Israel if it leaves the entire West Bank up to the 1967 borders. Not only did Israel not take up that offer, the Sharon administration was so terrified by the prospect of that offer gaining steam that it was one of the key reasons why they, in the end, withdrew from the Gaza Strip. They withdrew from that territory to entrench themselves elsewhere. So it's very, very difficult for me to see Israel leaving all of the West Bank, but at the same time, I think it's extremely possible for Israel to leave most of the West Bank.
Okay, well, it's interesting just to note in that context, you mentioned the agreement that Israel had, the Sharon government with, I think it was the George W. Bush administration at the time, with the disengagement from Gaza, and which required also Israel to withdraw from a few settlements in the northern West Bank, one of which I believe Israel is now moving back into
Homish
settlement. So yeah, sometimes those bargains don't necessarily hold into the future. But I want to thank you for that really fascinating presentation. I want to encourage all our audience members to go out and buy Rob's book, which is you can find the link to that on our page right here in the chat box. Since this is our final event of the academic year for us at the Nazarian Center, I want to thank all our audience members for joining us for all of our webinars from throughout the world. If you didn't catch all of them, they are available on our website as well as on our YouTube channel. And I want to encourage you all to sign up for our mailing list so you can learn about our future events and other news from the Nazarian Center. And wish you all a great summer. And thank you again, Rob, for that fascinating presentation.
Many thanks. And thank you for those excellent questions. Really appreciate it.